Hi, my name is Yen. I am a former Vietnamese refugee who escaped Vietnam when I was about 4 years old. Currently, I live in Singapore. I run my own social enterprise called Discovering Without Borders, and it's a social enterprise that reaches out to marginalised women and children in Singapore for STEM education. I lived in Singapore when I was 4 years old as a refugee. My family had escaped Vietnam and we were in Singapore for about 5 months. My memory of Singapore was very vague because I was such a young person, but there were times where I remember that I drank my first Fanta drink and how much joy that gave me. We didn't have any money except the money that the Norwegian government had given us as refugees because they had rescued my family when we were lost out at sea. The UNHCR at the time gave a new policy, and that policy allowed any refugees to choose a nation where they may have a relative and they could be resettled there. So instead of my family moving to Norway, which was the country that had rescued my family when we were lost out at sea, we had a very distant relative in Australia, in Queensland at the time. And so our course changed and we were resettled in Melbourne, Australia after staying in Singapore for 5 months. My experience in Australia was a lot more memorable because I was a little bit older by then, and as a refugee in Australia they put us up at the Altona Refugee Centre. We stayed there for about a year, and one of my fondest memories was eating Western food for the first time in my life. They gave us baked potatoes, baked carrots and roast chicken. And because my family were so new to eating Western food, we hoarded the food and kept it in our pockets and in bags so we could bring it back to our refugee rooms. I also knew that when I was growing up that I was the only Vietnamese person in my entire class and in my entire year level. And that did make me feel quite strange because I didn't understand the etiquette or the social norms of Australian people. So I struggled with my identity growing up in Australia for quite a while. My parents did not talk about the war. They did not talk about why we were refugees or why we had to escape. So for the first half of my preschool years, I had no connection or identity with why I was a refugee. And coming to Australia, where everybody to me was quite well off, was a struggle. My mum would pack me very local Vietnamese food that she had cooked, and local Vietnamese food in a lunchbox, being in there for a few hours, smells quite bad to Australian people. And so I knew that when I was eating my lunch, I was already very different from what other people were doing and eating. My family were always the Asian or the Vietnamese family in the entire school. And whenever there were festivities that were very localised to Australians, we would try and fit in as much as possible, but we were definitely very different. Until I started moving into a suburb that was mainly, predominantly ex-refugees, migrants, Vietnamese people. And then my identity started to come out a lot more, and I started to understand that we were from Vietnam and that we all shared a very similar story of escaping Vietnam. Whenever I think about the kindness of strangers, I remember what Singapore did for my family. I have an analogy that it's very similar to what Singaporeans might know of. They live in 2-bedroom HDB flats. They've got their mum, dad and 2 children plus the 2 elderly grandparents. So around 6 people living in a 2-bedroom HDB flat. The neighbour comes knocking on their door. The woman, her husband plus 3 children are escaping because their house has burned down and they've got nowhere else to go. And they're asking their neighbour, could they stay for a few months in their small flats? The neighbour, who lives in this tiny flat with 6 other people, has said, no, we have no room. And rightly so, they don't have room. But this poor neighbour who's lost their house and all their possessions keeps knocking on the door, keeps asking, keeps trying their very best to find a new home, temporary home for themselves. And to me, that reminds me of what Singapore did for my family. Singapore is a tiny nation. Back in the early 1980s, Singapore was struggling to find its feet. It was a tiny nation trying to become very prosperous, trying to look after its people, and it had its own set of social issues. But Vietnamese refugees were knocking on Singapore's door saying, let me in, give me shelter, give me temporary refuge, help me. I'm desperate. And I remember the kindness of Singapore, because it's not an easy decision for governments to make, to allow refugees into their nations, to transit to other nations. And Singapore took that opportunity very bravely, with a lot of courage, said, okay, we will take these refugees in for a season and a period of time, and then we want them resettled in other nations. And I think about this 2-bedroom HDB flat and what Singapore did for my family. In some ways, they put us in their bomb shelters. They put us in their tiny, tiny little spaces, whatever space they had, and gave us food, gave us shelter, showed us kindness. And if they didn't do that, we would have been just lost out at sea, and death would have been our consequence. We took to the seas, and we had no experience about being out in the boats out at sea. So when we took the opportunity to leave Vietnam and escape, it was really a matter of life or death. We were not thinking about trying to do anything else except survive. And it was a very risky decision. So I know that today a lot of people take out to the seas, they're in boats and they're trying to escape for other reasons, but my reason was because the war had ended and we were facing persecution. Today, when I see refugees, I see some nations providing social welfare, communities, people, translators, to help them assimilate into their country. And I think it's a wonderful way for refugees to be accepted, to be welcomed, and then to be transitioned into a new country where they can add value to the country, because there are opportunities for them to express and to share what they're going through. The barriers my family faced was that we didn't speak English. We didn't have opportunities to learn English as easily as we wanted it to be. If there were any English classes, it was taught totally in English, and there was no translator to help my parents understand these words that were new to them. And those were one of the biggest barriers for my family: communication, being able to express what our immediate needs were to organisations that perhaps could have provided us with help. Refugee Awareness Week means to me we are showing and shedding light upon human beings who desperately need help. And for me and my family, we were given a second chance at life. And we were refugees who were exactly in that situation. We were desperate, we were escaping a very difficult time in Vietnam, and we made a decision to leave our country with just the clothes on our back. And if we are able to raise awareness about what refugees are going through today, then we're showing people that together we can be kind, we can show compassion, empathy, and we can show love to people who are not our own, but we can accept them. I often get asked by millennials and young people about what they could do to help refugees around the world. And the current crisis might seem like a big problem, but they actually can do something. And my suggestion would be that they take a gap year. When they finish high school to when they start college, they can take a year off, and instead of going to the UK or other countries, they should choose countries or nations that actually harbour temporary refugees who live in these places. Go and work for a not-for-profit. Ask these not-for-profits what is happening at the refugee level. Find out the needs and go and meet that need. Use the skills that they actually have and see if they can invest and invent amazing technologies and ways to reach refugees and connect them to the rest of the world. That would be my suggestion.